Every civilization in human history has worshipped a god of war. These deities weren't just symbols of battle, they were reflections of what each culture feared, valued, and was willing to die for. Today I'm breaking down every major god of war across world mythologies. Starting with the oldest one on the list by over 1,000 years, Ishtar. Around 3400 BCE, the Sumerians worshipped a goddess who ruled over love, sex, fertility, and war all at the same time. To them, the same raw intensity that drove desire drove conquest. The same force that created life destroyed it. That was Ishtar. But here's where it gets interesting. She wasn't some passive fertility figure. She was called the Skirmisher, invoked in love spells and battlefield prayers in the same breath. Her symbol was the eight-pointed star of Venus, the planet that appears as both the morning and evening star, because Ishtar herself operated on both sides of every line. Then there's the underworld myth. She walked straight into the land of the dead to overthrow her own sister, Ereshkigal. At each of 7 gates she was stripped of her power until she stood completely naked before her sister's throne. Ereshkigal killed her. But Ishtar came back. She clawed her way out of death itself. And when she found her lover Dumuzi sitting on her throne, completely unbothered by her death, not mourning, just comfortable, she sent him to the underworld as her replacement. That's not a love goddess. That's a force of nature who doesn't forgive and doesn't forget. But, as terrifying as Ishtar was, the Egyptians had their own goddess who nearly wiped out humanity in a single night. Sekhmet. Ra had a problem. Humanity was getting out of line, so he did what any reasonable sun god would do. He turned his daughter into a lion-headed killing machine and pointed her at the human race. Sekhmet was never born to be a goddess. She was built to be a weapon. But here's where it gets complicated. She worked too well. Sekhmet tore through humanity with such ferocity that Ra himself panicked. His own creation was about to wipe out every living person on the planet, and he couldn't turn her off. So his grand solution? He ordered massive quantities of beer dyed red to look like blood, flooded the fields with it, and waited. Sekhmet found the red liquid, assumed it was blood, drank all of it, and passed out. The destroyer of humanity got too drunk to finish the job. That's not a myth. That's a Monday. But the Egyptians didn't treat her like a joke. Pharaoh Amenhotep III had hundreds of life-size granite statues of her carved during the 18th dynasty. Hundreds. You can still find them scattered across museums worldwide today. That's how seriously they took her power. And here's the part that reframes everything. The same priests who worshipped this goddess of plague and destruction became Egypt's first documented medical practitioners. By 2487 BCE, a healer named Ni-Ankh-Sekhmet cured a king's nosebleed, and by the 5th dynasty, her priests were inspecting bull meat for contamination to prevent disease from spreading to the population. They weren't just praying, they were inventing public health. The goddess of annihilation gave Egypt its first doctors. But if Sekhmet sacrificed her hand for nothing, wait until you meet the Norse god who sacrificed his for everything. Tyr's name literally means god. Not a god. The god. In Proto-Germanic, his name was the word for divinity itself, which tells you everything about how important he was before Odin muscled his way to the top. Tuesday's named after him. The Romans looked at Tyr and said, "That's our Mars." But here's the thing. Tyr wasn't really a war god. He was a god of justice who happened to be the bravest thing alive. And the proof is the story of Fenrir. Fenrir, the monstrous wolf, was growing more dangerous every day, and the gods needed to chain him before he destroyed everything. But Fenrir wasn't stupid. He refused to be bound unless one of the gods placed a hand in his mouth as a pledge of good faith. Every god in Asgard looked at that mouthful of teeth and backed away. Every god except Tyr. But Tyr knew the gods were lying. They had zero intention of releasing Fenrir. He put his sword hand into that wolf's mouth anyway. Not because he was tricked, because the binding was necessary, and someone had to pay the price for turning a lie into something resembling justice. Fenrir bit off Tyr's hand the moment he realized the chains would hold. And yet Norse sources suggest Tyr continued visiting Fenrir afterward, bringing the wolf food. Fenrir, chained and betrayed by the gods collectively, apparently didn't hold it against Tyr specifically, because Fenrir seemed to understand that Tyr had sacrificed just as much as he had. A one-handed god of justice, fated to die when Ragnarok arrives, still doing the job, still upholding the law, knowing full well how it ends. But if Tyr's sacrifice feels heavy, wait until you meet a goddess who doesn't just witness death on the battlefield, she decides who gets it. The Morrigan. She never picked up a sword, she never led a charge. The Morrigan showed up as a crow, hovered over a battlefield, and the outcome was already decided. That's what makes her terrifying. Every war god we've talked about so far operates through some combination of strength, sacrifice, or divine authority. The Morrigan operated through her voice. In the Battle of Moytura, one of the key texts in Irish mythology, she chants 3 bursts of incantation poetry called Roscada. The first poem incites the battle. The second declares victory. The third prophesies the end of the world. These weren't prayers or descriptions, they were weapons. She spoke and reality bent around the words. But here's where it gets genuinely strange. Nobody can agree on what she actually is. Some texts describe her as one of 3 sisters, the daughters of Ernmas, Badb, Macha, and Morrigan. Other texts use Morrigan and Badby interchangeably, as if they're the same entity. The whole triple goddess framing that gets thrown around constantly may not even come from the original sources. It might be a later interpretive layer scholars imposed on texts that never explicitly made that claim. So, is she one goddess? 3. Something in between. The honest answer is nobody knows, and the texts don't settle it. What is consistent is her shape-shifting. She could become a heifer, an eel, a wolf, a crow, moving between forms and realms in ways that placed her completely outside the normal boundaries of what a war deity is supposed to be. And here's the part that reframes everything. Scholars note she was primarily concerned with the prosperity of the land. Her warfare wasn't about glorifying combat. It was about defending sovereignty and fertility against external threats. She appeared to warriors fated to die washing their bloody armor beforehand, not to celebrate their deaths, but to mark the cost of protecting what mattered. She didn't fight wars. She decided them. And if you think a goddess who whispers poems to change the course of battle sounds strange, wait until you meet the Greek god of war, who actually charges into combat and gets beaten up by literally everyone. Ares. Every mythology on this list treats their god of war with some level of respect. The Greeks looked at theirs and said, absolutely not. Ares is the son of Zeus and Hera, one of the 12 Olympians, and somehow the most disrespected deity in the entire Greek pantheon. He's the god of war who can't stop losing fights, and I can prove it. In the Iliad, Athena knocks him flat with a boulder. His scream of pain is described as being louder than 10,000 men screaming at once. Does he get up and fight back? No. He runs to Zeus crying about it, and this isn't a one-time thing. Ares gets humiliated in the Iliad repeatedly, wounded by mortals with Athena's help, screaming loud enough to shake the battlefield, then immediately retreating to complain to Daddy. But the battlefield wasn't even his worst moment. Hephaestus, the god of forges, caught Ares sleeping with his wife Aphrodite. So Hephaestus built a magical net, trapped both of them in it mid-affair, and then invited every single god on Olympus to come point and laugh. The god of war got publicly humiliated by a blacksmith, and nobody defended him. Here's the thing, the Greeks did this on purpose. Ares had almost no temples in the major cultural centers of Greece. His cult was concentrated in places like Thessaly and Thrace, far from Athens and the cities that shaped Greek thought. The Homeric hymn to Ares literally asks him to give warriors strength while simultaneously praying he'd steer them away from violence. They wanted his power, but not his personality. And that's because the Greeks already had a war god they actually respected. Athena represented strategic, disciplined warfare, the kind that builds civilizations and wins wars with planning. Ares represented what happens when you strip all that away. Pure bloodlust. No strategy, no purpose, just violence for the sake of violence. The Greeks were philosophically sophisticated enough to look at war and say, there are 2 kinds, and one of them is stupid. Then they gave the stupid kind its own god and spent centuries making fun of him. But here's what's fascinating. When the Romans inherited Ares, they didn't just rename him. They completely reinvented him. Mars. Where Ares was a cosmic embarrassment, Mars was a father. Literally. The Romans called him Pater, the father of the Roman people, and they venerated him as the foundation of their entire civilization, Same divine domain as Ares. Completely different cultural meaning. Ares was a problem, Mars was the solution. But here's where it gets interesting. Mars wasn't just a war god. He governed both war and agriculture simultaneously, because to early Romans, these were the same thing. His festivals in March, the month literally named after him, and October bookended both the military campaigning season and the farming season at the same time. You couldn't separate the sword from the plow. And his priests proved it. The Salii, which translates to jumpers, were armored warrior priests who performed leaping three-step war dances through the streets of Rome, carrying shields and swords. Picture that for a second. Fully armed men doing synchronized jumping routines through the city because the springing motion was believed to magically accelerate crop growth. Warrior priests doing fertility rituals, that's Rome for you. But the real nightmare fuel is the October horse. Every year on October 15th, the right-hand horse of the winning chariot team was killed with a spear in the Campus Marius, the Field of Mars. Its head and tail were cut off, and then different city districts literally fought each other in the streets for the right to display the severed head. This was the only horse sacrifice in all of Roman tradition, and it happened every single year like clockwork. Then Augustus took things further. After defeating Caesar's assassins at Philippi, he created the cult of Mars the Avenger, politically weaponizing the god to frame Roman military action as divine justice. Mars wasn't just protecting Rome anymore, he was justifying its expansion. But if you think Rome politicized its war god, wait until you meet a deity who demanded something far more extreme than a horse's head. Huitzilopochtli. Every other war god on this list asks for devotion. Huitzilopochtli demanded something far more specific. He needed human blood to keep the sun from going out. And that's not metaphor, that's not poetic language. The Aztecs genuinely believed that every single sunrise was the result of a cosmic battle, and that if their god lost, the world would be swallowed by infinite darkness. Here's how the cosmology works. Huitzilopochtli is the sun. His siblings are the moon and the stars, and every day, he has to fight all of them off just to make the sky light up again. If he runs out of strength, the sun dies. Not dims, not weakens. Dies. Permanent night. End of everything. Human blood was the fuel that kept him going. But here's the part that changes how you think about this entire system. Warriors who died in battle or were sacrificed weren't considered victims. They were called the Eagle's People, and they were believed to physically join Huitzilopochtli in his eternal fight across the sky. Death in his service wasn't a loss, it was a promotion. And this wasn't always the plan. Huitzilopochtli was originally a minor deity, barely worth mentioning. It took a political reformer named Tlacaelel to deliberately elevate him to the level of Quetzalcoatl and Tlaloc, restructuring Aztec religion around him to justify imperial expansion. The theology was engineered to serve the empire, but the cosmic terror driving it was real. The physical evidence is staggering. At the Hueyi-Tzompantli skull rack near the Templo Mayor, archaeologists have confirmed 603 human skulls as of 2020. Some post-conquest sources claim between 10,000 and 80,400 people were sacrificed over 4 days during the Great Pyramid's reconsecration in 1487. The higher number is heavily disputed, but isotope studies on the skulls prove the victims came from all across Mesoamerica. This wasn't local. This was industrial. And then there's his name. Huitzilopochtli translates to resuscitated warrior of the south, Fa'akir from Huitzilin, meaning hummingbird, and Opochtli, meaning left, because the Aztecs believed dead warriors came back as hummingbirds. The most terrifying war god in the Western Hemisphere, the one who demanded rivers of blood to keep reality from collapsing, is named after the smallest bird on Earth. But if Huitzilopochtli's power came from blood and sunlight, the next god on this list earned his through something completely different. Divine birth, a sacred spear, and a demon that no one else in the universe could kill. Kartikeya. The gods needed a weapon, not a sword, not a spell, a child. Specifically, Shiva's child. Because the demon, Tarekasura, had secured a boon that made him nearly invincible, with one very specific loophole: only a son of Shiva could kill him. The problem? Shiva was deep in meditation, and had zero interest in fatherhood, so the other gods had to essentially scheme their way into making Shiva have a baby, and it worked. Kartikeya, also known as Skanda or Murugan, was born from 6 divine conceptions simultaneously, raised by 6 cosmic mothers called the Kritikas, and then fused into a single 6-headed deity, each head facing a different direction, 12 arms carrying different weapons, and he aged from infant to supreme commander of the gods' armies in what amounted to an instant. He didn't grow up, he arrived. But here's where Kartikeya separates himself from every other war god on this list. His primary weapon, the Vel, a spear given to him by his mother Parvati, doesn't just represent combat. It symbolizes spiritual knowledge, the power to pierce through illusion and ignorance, not just flesh. This is a war god whose signature weapon is literally enlightenment. And the way he used it is unforgettable. When he faced the demon Surapadma, who had shapeshifted into a massive mango tree to avoid death, Kartikeya split the tree clean in half with his Vel. One half of that tree became his peacock mount. The other half became the rooster on his battle standard. He didn't just defeat his enemy. He absorbed him into his own identity. Mentions of Kartikeya in Sanskrit literature date back to the 5th century BCE, making him one of the oldest continuously worshipped war deities still actively venerated today, particularly across South India, Sri Lanka, Singapore, and Malaysia. But here's the part that makes him truly unique. He's not just worshipped as a warrior, he's revered as a god of wisdom, a philosopher-teacher, and a patron of Tamil poetry and literature. 6 heads commanding divine armies, also inspiring devotional verse. But if a war god who writes poetry sounds refined, the next deity on this list built civilization with a machete and swears oaths on iron, Ogun. Every war god we've covered so far governs the battlefield. Ogun governs the blade itself. And every single thing humans have ever done with one. In Yoruba cosmology, Ogun holds the title Osun Imole, the first of the primordial Orishas to descend to earth. Before any other divine being set foot here, Ogun came down with an iron machete and literally cut the path through the wilderness for civilization to begin. The other Orishas followed the trail he carved. Without him, they don't arrive. Without him, the world stays wild. But here's where his domain gets interesting. Ogun doesn't just rule over war, he rules over iron. All of it, which means blacksmiths answer to him, surgeons answer to him, butchers, engineers, warriors, anyone whose hands touch a blade or a tool forged from metal. A scalpel removing a tumor and a machete swung in battle exist in the same divine territory. That's not a metaphor. That's his actual jurisdiction. And he enforces it. In Yoruba courts, oaths aren't sworn on holy books. They're sworn on a sacred machete dedicated to Ogun. You kiss the iron, you speak the truth. If you lie, the belief isn't that Ogun will punish you someday. The belief is that the iron itself will bite the liar. Justice isn't something administered in his name. It's embedded in his material. But the part that hits hardest is how far his worship traveled. When enslaved Africans were brought to the Americas, Ogun came with them. His worship survived the Middle Passage and took root in Candomblé, Santeria, Haitian Vodou, and West African Vodun. In Santeria, he was syncretized with Catholic saints including St. Peter, St. George, and St. Michael. They couldn't erase him. And according to legend, when conflict made the world unbearable, Ogun didn't retreat. He transformed himself into the Iroko tree, merging with its roots, becoming something else entirely to protect others. The tree is still considered sacred, a reminder that even a god of iron knew when to stop fighting and start sheltering. But if Ogun proves a war, God can govern everything humans build. The next one proves a war, God can hold an entire nation together for over 1,000 years. Hachiman. Hachiman is not a god of war. Not really. He's a tutelary god of warriors, meaning his job is to protect the people who fight, not to encourage the fighting itself. That distinction might sound minor, but in Japanese religious culture it mattered enormously. Hachiman doesn't glorify combat, he watches over those forced into it, but here's where it gets interesting. Since the Heian period, roughly 794 to 1185 CE, Hachiman has been identified as the deified spirit of Emperor Ojin, the legendary 15th emperor of Japan. That makes him the only deity on this entire list who was explicitly understood to be a specific historical ruler who became a god after death, not a mythological figure, not a cosmic force born from divine parents, a real emperor, elevated to godhood through centuries of devotion. The Minamoto clan adopted him as their patron deity, and from there, his worship spread throughout the entire samurai class. The result? Somewhere between 25,000 and 44,000 Hachiman shrines exist across Japan today, making him one of the most widely worshipped deities in the entire country. That number alone tells you more about his cultural importance than any single myth ever could. But here's the part that catches people off guard. The Omiya Hachimengu Shrine in Tokyo, one of the largest Shinto shrines in the city, is specifically associated with protecting women during childbirth and raising children. A shrine dedicated to the patron god of samurai warriors doubles as a maternity blessing site. That's not a contradiction in Japanese religious thinking, that's the whole point. Hachiman protects people whether they're holding a sword or holding a newborn, and it gets even better. Before the Olympics, citizens of Sendai flocked to Osaki Hachimengu to pray for figure skater Yusuru Hanyu's victory. His photo is displayed at the shrine's main gates to this day. A deity that once watched over feudal samurai charging into battle is now petitioned for Olympic gold medals in figure skating. That's not a decline in relevance. That's a living religion doing exactly what living religions do, evolving with the people who practice them. But if a deified emperor becoming Japan's most ubiquitous god sounds remarkable, wait until you hear about a Chinese general whose path to godhood might be even more dramatic. Guan Yu. Every other god on this list was born divine. Guan Yu earned it. Born around 160 CE, he was a real general serving under the warlord Liu Bei during the brutal collapse of the Han Dynasty. He fought real battles, commanded real armies, and died in 220 CE after being captured and executed. That should have been the end of his story. But Guan Yu was so legendarily loyal, so impossibly righteous, that people just started worshipping him after he died. Not because a priest told them to. Regular people looked at this man's life and said, Igor, that's a god. The state didn't make it official until the Sui dynasty, but by then, they were just catching up to what everyone already believed. But here's where it gets genuinely strange. Guan Yu is venerated across Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism simultaneously. Three systems with fundamentally different theologies all independently looked at the same man and agreed he belonged in their pantheon. For Confucians, he's a warrior sage. For Taoists, he's a leading subduer of demons. For Buddhists, he's the Sangharama Bodhisattva. No other historical figure in East Asian history pulled that off. Now here's the part nobody talks about. A huge portion of what people worship isn't even historically accurate. The 14th century novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms dramatized his life so powerfully that the fictional version basically replaced the real one. And people worship the legend anyway. At what point does the belief become more real than the history? And then there's the detail that honestly sounds like a joke but isn't. Guan Yu is simultaneously the patron deity of the Hong Kong police force and of triads in criminal gangs. Both sides pray to the god of righteousness. Cops ask him to catch criminals, criminals ask him to evade cops. The same god, hearing both prayers, supposedly the embodiment of justice. He went from a mortal general to quite literally everywhere. But if you think a human becoming a god is the strangest thing on this list, wait until you meet the Aztec deity who could see your darkest secrets just by making you look in a mirror. Tezcatlipoca. Every god on this list has a domain. Some have 2, maybe 3. Tezcatlipoca had the night sky, hurricanes, obsidian, hostility, discord, rulership, divination, temptation, jaguars, sorcery, beauty, war, and conflict. That's not a god of war. That's a god of everything that keeps you awake at 3 a.m. His name means smoking mirror, and that mirror is the detail that stays with you long after everything else fades. Tezcatlipoca carried an obsidian mirror on his chest, in his headdress, or, in some depictions, replacing his right foot entirely. Priests used these polished volcanic glass mirrors to travel to the realm of gods and ancestors. Warriors who stared into the mirror's smoky depths reportedly saw their own deaths reflected back at them. The mirror didn't predict the future. It showed you the truth about yourself, whether you wanted to see it or not. But here's where his mythology gets genuinely unhinged. Tezcatlipoca ruled the first sun, the first age of the entire world. Then Quetzalcoatl knocked him out of the sky with a stone club, so Tezcatlipoca turned himself into a jaguar, sent jaguars to devour every giant living on Earth, and ended the entire world out of pure spite. That wasn't enough. During the second sun, he turned all of humanity into monkeys. 2 ages of existence, both destroyed because Tezcatlipoca refused to lose gracefully. And yet none of that is the darkest thing about him. The Tuxcatl Festival is the most psychologically complex ritual in any mythology I've covered. 1 full year before the ceremony, a captured warrior was selected to live as Tezcatlipoca incarnate. He was bathed, dressed as a god, given 4 wives, feasted, celebrated, and honored in every possible way. For 12 months, this man lived the greatest life anyone in the Aztec world could imagine. He was literally treated as a living deity walking among mortals. Then, on the day of the festival, he walked up the temple steps himself and was sacrificed. His heart was cut out with an obsidian knife. Accounts describe victims ascending those steps with dignity and pride. No chains. No dragging. They walked willingly. The god of temptation and psychological warfare was worshipped by giving someone everything they could ever want, then taking it all away in a single afternoon. That's not a ritual. That's a thesis on the human condition. But here's the part that might be the darkest joke in all of Aztec theology. Tezcatlipoca, the god responsible for tempting humans into self-destruction, discord, and ruin, could also cleanse humans of contamination, absolve their guilt, and reverse their fate. The same deity who pushed you toward the edge was the one you called when you needed to be pulled back from it. He broke you, and he fixed you, and there was nobody else to turn to for either. That's Tezcatlipoca. His mirror doesn't show you what's there, it shows you what's true. And sometimes that's the most terrifying weapon any god has ever carried. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.